Hi, this is Becky Spain, your instructor for business communications. Today we will be reviewing Chapter 2 in Excellence in Business Communication. Chapter 2 is Collaboration, Interpersonal Communication, and Business Etiquette. So let's begin by reviewing our learning objectives. The first few slides list the learning objectives for the entire chapter. I'll let you read those on your own. Let's begin by looking at learning objective number 1, which we'll look at together. Once again, I'm just hitting the highlights of the chapter, and I'm expecting that you're reading and reviewing the PowerPoint as you read through your chapter. It'll help you to identify main thoughts and ideas and information that you'll be responsible for throughout this semester. But I do want to bring some of the points to your attention and discuss them with you in a little bit further detail. So, learning objective number 1. List the advantages and disadvantages of working in teams, describe the characteristics of effective teams, and highlight 4 key issues of group dynamics. So let's begin by looking at communicating effectively in teams. As the workforce continues to redefine itself in today's market, you'll find that more and more work is being done in teams, and your ability to be able to understand how to function in a team and how to become most productive in working in a team will be a critical skill that you'll take away from this course. You're going to find that you're going to be asked to collaborate on a wide variety of projects and assignments. Now, a collaboration is working together to meet business challenges, and the book tells us that working collaboratively has become a core job responsibility for half of the U.S. workforce. There are lots of advantages in working in a team. One of it is that a team as a whole increases the amount of information, knowledge, experience that's brought to the table so that you can address whatever assignment that you've been given or problem that you've been given to resolve. You'll have a greater amount of knowledge at the table around possible solutions or how to roll out a project. There's also diversity of viewpoints. Anytime you have the opportunity to look at a solution from a lot of different angles, and you have people who see issues in different lights, and you have a chance to view those from all of those different angles, you're going to have a better product in the end. However, having diversity of viewpoints can also be a disadvantage to a team because sometimes it causes conflict in trying to come together on a specific solution or way to handle a project. And working through some of the issues of diverse opinions is going to be one of the skills that having really great communication skills will help you to be able to address better. Some other disadvantages of working on a team can be groupthink. So have you ever been at a meeting or even just hanging out with your friends and someone says something and this is the way they want to go or what they want to do? Maybe they've chosen a movie but you don't really want to see that movie, or they're making comments about a movie that you don't agree with, and you just keep your mouth shut because you don't want to cause conflict or be the only one that has that opinion. So you don't want to say, hey, I really thought that movie was terrible when everybody else in the entire group thought it was wonderful. Well, when you're on a team and you think that way and you don't say what you really think, you're weakening the team. So in order to have a stronger team, you need to have an environment and a work structure that as you're working within that team, it's okay for people to say, well, I hear what you're saying, but I'm not sure that I agree, and this is why. Or here are my thoughts, and they're different from yours, but I'd like to give you what I'm thinking so that you can consider that. That will help you to come to not have groupthink. And once again, you're going to have a stronger product in the end. Now, a hidden agenda is when a person has private counterproductive motives that undermine what someone else on the that undermines someone else on the team. This can happen whenever maybe they have their own personal agenda and they're trying to drive that rather than the reason that the entire team is together. This can also be very counterproductive to a team. And last is the high cost. Not only in trying to align your schedules or arrange meetings, but anytime you call a meeting, you have to stop to think, okay, who's at the table right now? And let's say that you have 6 people that are sitting around the table and you're there for an hour and a half. One of the ways to consider the cost of that meeting is that you have to figure out What is each person getting paid? Let's just say they're making $20 an hour. Well, if you're there for an hour and a half, that's $30 per person. And if you've got 6 people around the table, that meeting just for labor costs you $180. So you have to be cautious of the price of having a bunch of people come together, and then the amount of time that you are together, that's always costing your company. And we'll look at that again later whenever you have a meeting, who do you invite to the meeting? And that's something that needs to be considered. Anytime you bring somebody into a meeting when they really don't need to be there, you're actually costing your company money because their wage is being paid out for them to sit into a meeting that they are really not needed for. So let's look at some of the characteristics of an effective team. An effective team, if you want the most effective team, you need to have a clear objective and a shared sense of purpose. Why are we here? What is it that we're trying to accomplish? You need to establish an atmosphere where you can communicate openly and honestly. Like I mentioned earlier, you have thoughts that are contrary to the group, that you feel like it's okay for you to speak out and say, I hear what you're saying, but this is what I'm thinking, and this is why I'm thinking that. You need to have open, honest communication. A team's work product is only going to be as good as their ability to work together openly and honestly, and to really assess what's going on, the information that's being exchanged, and the decisions that are being made. And if you don't have that open, honest communication, then whatever your product is from your meeting is going to be tainted. So let's go on to learning objective number 2, which is offer guidelines for collaborative communication, identify major collaborative technologies, and explain how to give constructive feedback. So as I mentioned, when your team collaborates well, various members can produce results that transcend what an individual alone could do. This is sometimes referred to as synergy. You've probably heard that term before, but let me give you an example of synergy. So what you can do by yourself is one thing, but what you can do as a group is going to be exponentially greater. So let's look at an example of a mule and how many pounds that a mule can pull. So if a mule is pulling a load, one mule can actually pull 8,000 pounds all by himself. So you would think that if there were 2 mules that were hooked up together, those 2 mules would probably be able to pull up to 16,000 pounds together, since one mule can pull 8,000 pounds. But the truth of the matter is that 2 mules can pull 24,000 pounds, or 3 times as much weight. And that's an example of synergy, which is what will happen when you have a team that works together effectively. So to have synergy on a team, or to work well in a collaborative effort, everyone on the team needs to be open and flexible. You need to be able to agree on goals and give the team time to actually bond. You do need to take some time and get to know one another so that you can work well with one another, and you need to take a few minutes to clarify each person's individual responsibilities. Now, if you're writing collaboratively, which the book addresses on page 41, it's important to note that you should most likely avoid writing as a group. Rather, if you have a writing assignment, it's better to give portions of the writing to certain people and then come back together and review that. It's really difficult to write any type of a document of any length as a group. So it's better to divide that up and then let individuals go and do the writing, send that out for others to preview, then come back together to make comments on how they want to finalize the writing process. In helping to walk through the process of reviewing each other's work, there's lots of different opportunities to use technology for that. Even in simple Word, there are programs that will allow you to review and to comment, and then people can review what your comments were about the writing. They can accept it or reject it, or even edit what you've said. So I don't know what will be available to you in the company that you're working for, but chances are the organization will have something that's normal for them to use, and you'll utilize that. But I know as an instructor doing writing intensive, I prefer to use Word and just do tracking changes so that you can see what my thoughts are about what you need to change in a document. And that works really well because it gives the person who wrote it an opportunity to review your comments and accept them, reject them, or edit them before they move on. And looking at some of the technologies for writing, there is groupware, which is an umbrella term for systems that let people simultaneously communicate and share files. You can present information and work on documents. Cloud computing expands the way in which geographically dispersed teams can collaborate. So you may find yourself at times working with people who are in your office, but you may also find yourself at times working with individuals who are located in other offices across the United States or even around the world. I know that when I worked for Bank One, my boss was in New York, and then one of my peers was in Chicago, and another one was in Florida. So we did a lot of cloud computing and groupware in order to get our projects worked together and communicate with one another. Chances are that at some point in your work life, you will have peers or even bosses that are not located where you live. And so learning to use technologies for your collaborative writing and for your collaborative projects will be essential to your success in the business world. Before we move on, let me also just touch on an intranet and an extranet. I know you all know what the intranet is, but an intranet is just specifically for individuals that work within the company, and an extranet would be for individuals within the company as well as other selected individuals, possibly customers or people who are working as paid labor or temporary hires for the organization. And understanding how to use an intranet is very important because most larger organizations put everything that you need to know about how to function within the organization out on their intranet, and then you have to figure out how to file the forms, find the information, make requests or whatever within the intranet. So want to make sure that you're familiar with that term. Chances are in your work life, you will become very familiar with how to utilize a company's intranet in order to be able to function within that organization. And as we talked about yesterday, of course, mobile devices are becoming a larger part of our communication because almost everybody has a mobile phone and much of our work is being done on our mobile devices. And mobile devices bring a new dimension to collaboration by connecting employees and business partners who work part-time, who work full-time, who work outside the conventional office environment. A lot of the work is now being done on mobile devices. The last part of this learning objective looks at giving and responding to constructive feedback. Constructive feedback is also sometimes called constructive criticism, and if you've ever given a speech in college, I'm sure that you received constructive feedback or constructive criticism, probably also on writing assignments that you've made for classes. Constructive feedback should focus on the process and on the outcomes of the communication and not necessarily on the people involved. It can become destructive feedback whenever it delivers criticism with no guidance to stimulate improvement. When you are asked to give constructive feedback, you need to make sure that you're looking specifically at the work and not at the person, and don't personally attack. That's really critically important. You should be able to state specifically what the issue is with the product or with the writing and not attack the person. Like, you never get this right. You always say that wrong. Those are things that are not constructive. You want to make sure that you give the person clear guidelines for improvement, such as, this part of the writing is unclear to me, and then perhaps if you XYZ, then it might make this more clear. That's good, strong, constructive criticism because you've told them what you don't understand, and then you've given them ideas for what they might do with their writing to help you to better understand. Okay, moving on to learning objective number 3. List the key steps needed to ensure productive team meetings. In preparing for a meeting, you need to figure out how you can increase your productivity of the meeting so that as you meet, there's actually a reason for the meeting and that you're able to accomplish something during the meeting. If you have meetings where you don't stay on track, nothing is resolved, people leave, and they don't really know why they just spent an hour in that room with you, people are going to stop coming to the meetings and they're going to stop participating. So there's some things that you can do to make sure that you prepare well for a meeting. And the first is that you need to clearly identify the purpose for your meeting, whether it's going to be informational or whether it's going to be decision making. Then you need to decide who needs to be at this meeting. And once again, one of the things that you need to consider is to not have people there that you're going to be, that you could easily update by giving them a memo or an email after the meeting to say we met and this is what we decided. I want to make sure you were up to speed on that. Only have people participating in the meeting that there really is value in having them there. That respects your peers' time, and that also respects the cost of having a meeting for your company. You need to choose the venue and the time where you're going to have the meeting and the time that you're going to have the meeting. It may very well be that you need to reserve the room and know that you need to know how to do that. Chances are, if you're with a larger organization, you probably do that on the intranet. You need to set your agenda. This is really critical. If you can sit down and write what it is that you're going to do and how much time you're going to allot to each thing that you're going to do and send that out to the participants ahead of time, then people can prepare for the meeting prior to coming. They're going to bring whatever they need to the meeting, and then you're also going to be able to stay on task and focused because you know this is what we're talking about first and how much time we've given to talk about this, then second, and then third. If you have not allotted enough time to talk about something and your conversation goes long, you can either say, this is all the time that we've allotted to this, let's come back to this at a later time, or you can choose as a group to realign the agenda and spend more time on this topic and less time on other items that you had given time to. It seems a little bit like overkill if you've never actually run a meeting and used that as a tool. And I know the first few times I did that, I thought, seriously, we're going to actually say this is all the time that we had to discuss this and we didn't come up with something. But whenever I got used to doing that, what I found was that oftentimes it helped us to bring our conversations to a conclusion and go ahead and move along to a solution or a next step by saying, look, we've discussed this for the 20 minutes that we've given time on this. We need to either make a decision or move forward. Then sometimes that brings people to the point of saying, okay, I think we've talked about this enough. Let's say this is what we're going to do. And then they move forward that way. So it can actually be a great tool in moving your meetings along and yet being respectful of other people's time. Other tips on conducting and contributing to effective meetings. Keeping discussions on track is really important. It's so hard, especially if you really like the people that you work with, to not get off on rabbit trails, but to actually have a way to bring people back on track and say, okay guys, we're off track. That's a rabbit trail. Let's talk about that later. Or you can say things like, let's put that in the parking lot and then we'll talk about that at a different time. It may sound funny to you at this point, but actually having a piece of paper or using a dry board to list topics that are getting you off track of what you have come together to discuss can be a very helpful tool to say what you're talking about is important, but that's not what we're doing in this meeting. So let's put it in the parking lot. We'll talk about this at a later time and let's stay focused on why we're together today. That helps people to know that they were heard and not just kind of like, this is what you're talking about. It's not important. Let's get focused on why we're here. It's really a great tool to use in meetings. You want to make sure that you're encouraging everyone to participate. Sometimes you'll have people in the meeting who are very vocal, and you're going to have some people who are more quiet and they like to think about what's being said and what's being discussed, and they're going to hold themselves back and not talk. So as a participant, and especially as a leader, it's important that you say, Susie, we haven't heard from you on this topic. Have you had a chance to think what you're about what we're discussing and your ideas, and can you contribute, give us some ideas on what your thoughts are? Then that helps to make sure that everyone is participating and everyone has an opportunity to have their voice heard. Though mobile devices are wonderful ways to oftentimes to hold meetings, when you're in a meeting and it's a face-to-face meeting, you may need to make sure that you're using your mobile device respectfully. If you are using it to take notes or to do something else that's in line with what's happening in the meeting, it's a good thing to say, I've got my phone with me and I'm going to take notes during the meeting, so that others know that you're not like Facebooking or playing games, but that you're actually involved in the meeting and that what you're doing is one of the ways that you're participating in the meeting. It is really very rude to everyone that's in the room whenever you are doing personal business during the meeting, whether it's answering emails or responding to text messages, or whatever it is that you're doing, because other people have come together, they've set their personal agenda aside to work together as a team, and if you're doing other things, it is distracting you. You may think that you're multitasking, but chances are you're only paying half attention to what's happening in the room, and you're being disrespectful to the others who've given up their time to be in that meeting with you. So unless your mobile device is helping you to be more productive in the meeting, turn it off, put it aside, or better yet, leave it in your office. Closing meetings effectively. Make sure that if you have said the meeting is going to start at 1 and be over at 2, that you start at 1 and that you will finish at 2. Going late on meetings cause problems with people's agendas. They have scheduled things at 2 o'clock, or they thought that they would have that time available to work on things in their office. And if you have only asked for their time until 2 o'clock, you need to end your meeting at 2 o'clock. If you've not been able to accomplish what you needed to during that time, then you need to discuss as a group whether you should have another meeting to continue, or whether the deliverables could be done, could be discussed through email or some other format, or whether another meeting is actually the best thing to do at that point. The book provides a sample meeting agenda, and you're going to find that there's tons of different sample meetings out on the intranet that you can use as well. Chances are the best thing to do is to look at what others in the company are doing and follow the format for the agenda that they're using, because there's tons of different types of agendas, and there are tons of different ways to allocate like your time settings. So just look to see what is the norm for your company and then follow that. And if you have to create an agenda before you've had an opportunity to review that, just ask a peer if you can get a copy of an agenda that they've created and then follow the format. So after the meeting is over and you have results, now what? Well, one of the most critical things, and people hate to do it, but it will certainly drive productivity of your group, is to have written meeting minutes. You need to be able to list any decisions that were made as a result of your conversations, and then also who's responsible for doing what. So if you have that in the minutes and you send that out to the people who are in the meeting, they can look to say, yes, I agree that this is what we talked about. This is the action that we decided on. We decided that Susie is going to do XYZ and Paul is going to do XYZ. These are the time frames that they're going to have them by. And then as a follow-up, we're going to meet again in 2 weeks to review our progress in this situation. If you put all of that in meeting minutes, it will not only help for everybody to be on the same page and for Susie and Paul to know what's expected of them, but will also help whenever 2 weeks later it's time for your meeting and you're like, great Scott, I can't remember. What did we do at the last meeting? Where are we? You've got it written. You know where to pick up. You know what agenda to create, because you're just taking that and trying to move that ball forward. So it's a really awesome tool. No one likes taking minutes and no one likes writing meeting minutes up, but it will really help your productivity and make the meetings that you are having have more value. Learning objective number 4 is identify the major technologies used to enhance or replace in-person meetings. So since chances are that everybody that you're working with on a team is not physically located in the same place, you're going to have to use virtual meeting tools in order to be able to have meetings. So whether that's instant messaging, or whether it's teleconferencing, or whether it's a web-based meeting, there are going to be tools that are specific to your company that they normally use. When I worked at Bank One, we did virtual meetings by teleconferencing where we could see each other's faces. There are pros and cons to that. Sometimes it's a little distracting, but it's also good to be able to see people's faces as you're talking to them. It helps to build relationships. So if that's available, that's a good thing to do. But you can also have web-based meetings where it's just your voice and you can still exchange information. Some things about having meetings, whether teleconferencing or whether you're doing it just a voice only meeting, you need to make sure that you can put your phone on mute so that background noises aren't coming through. Be careful about where you are. I actually was in a meeting one time and somebody must have been mobile while they're having their meetings, and they must have gone into the bathroom for some reason, and across the line as we had our meeting going on, you heard somebody flushing the toilet. And everybody thought that was really funny, but I'm sure it was really embarrassing for the person that happened to. So you need to be careful about background noises. I was also on a teleconference one time where the person's phone was not on mute. They obviously were working from home, and there were children screaming and crying and throwing fits in the background that everybody could hear, and it was incredibly distracting to the purpose of the teleconference. So just make sure that if you are using one of these virtual meeting methods, that you're being respectful of the other people who are on there. Use your mute button when you're not talking, and make sure that you're not taking the call into places that would be inappropriate to those that are in your business relationship with you. Okay, so, and that's just a face-to-face meeting. So moving on to learning objective number 5, identify 3 major modes of listening, describe the listening process, and explain the problems of selective listening. So the listening process, we talked about this just briefly in our first chapter when we reviewed that together, but listening is actually a critically important skill that you need to develop. 80% of top executives actually say that listening is the most important skill needed if you want to get things done in the workplace today. And especially because the younger generation employees place a very high premium on being heard, it's important that you not only become a good listener, but that you also learn how to make sure people know that you're listening. How can you help people to know that you're actually listening to what they have to say? Eye contact is really critically important, and so many people are like, I can look elsewhere and I can still be listening, and that may be true, and it may not be true, but it may be true. But the truth of the matter is the person who's speaking doesn't know that you're listening. So, so much of what we're talking about applies not only to the business world, but also to your personal relationships. And my husband's a little bit on the hyperactive side, so he's often wanting to do something else while I'm talking to him. And I've had this conversation with him before. If I'm talking and you're doing something else while I'm talking, I don't feel like you're listening to me, that you're really hearing what I'm saying. And he says, well, I can hear what you're saying. Just because I'm putting up the dishes in the dishwasher or doing something else doesn't mean I'm not listening to you. But I'm like, but I don't know that you're listening to me whenever you're doing something else. And so in order for him to help me to understand that I'm being heard when I'm talking to him, he now stops what he's doing and makes eye contact with me. So whether it is a significant other in your life or someone else that is in your workplace, a peer, someone who works for you, or your boss, whatever you're doing, you need to stop doing it and make eye contact with that person so that they know that they're being heard. And as they're talking, don't be forming in your mind what your responses are going to be, but rather be thinking, do I understand what this person is saying? And then asking questions back by saying, okay, so what I hear you saying is that the way that we did this project didn't make our customer happy, and that we need to make changes XYZ. Is that correct? And then they know that you've heard them because you've paraphrased what they've been talking about and helped them to understand that. And even if you're not at the point yet where you're ready to paraphrase, your nodding of your head and leaning forward so that you're leaning toward that person helps them to understand that you're hearing what they're saying and that you're interested in what they're saying. So those are some of your some nonverbal cues that can help the person that you're talking with know and understand that you're interested in what they're saying and that you're hearing them. So understanding the listening process. I think I'm a good listener. You may think you're a good listener, but the truth of the matter is that in general, people listen at or below a 25% efficiency rate, which means that within 48 hours, you are only going to remember 25% of a conversation, 25% or less of a conversation that you've had with someone. And to further complicate that, you may think that you remember everything correctly, but it may not be exactly as what the person said. You may not actually remember everything, that information that was given, and remember it correctly. But there are 5 separate steps to the listening process, which kind of mirrors the communication that we talked about last chapter. And the first step, of course, is receiving what was said. And then second is decoding it or understanding it. The third step is remembering it. The fourth step is evaluating it for the quality of information. And are you correctly evaluating what was heard. And then finally, the last step is responding to the message. There are actually lots of barriers in effective listening. Some of those we've already talked about, but one I want to make sure that we discuss is called selective listening. It's actually one of the most common barriers to effective listening. If your mind wanders, you may actually completely tune out what that other person is saying until you hear a word or a phrase that gets your attention again. And then by then you may not be able to recall exactly what was said. And so we actually have a tendency to just fill in what we thought that the speaker probably said. So I don't know if that's ever happened to you when you're listening to a professor give a lecture and it's like, oh, I think I may need to know that. What did they say? I can't remember. Oh, I think I know what it was. And then that wasn't what the professor said at all. And then you missed the test on the question on the quiz. Well, that happens in real life all of the time. We also have a tendency to fill things in the way that we wanted to hear them, and that can also lead to miscommunication from actually hearing what the person who said it was actually saying. I'm sure your mind never wonders while a professor is giving a lecture. Your mind has not wondered why you're listening to this of mine today here, I'm sure, right? Okay, yeah. I know that there are times whenever it's difficult to stay focused and you need to learn different ways to make sure that you're able to keep engaged whenever you're listening to someone that you're having a hard time staying engaged with. But one of the reasons why we have a tendency to, our mind has a tendency to drift is that when we're speaking, we're only speaking at 120 to 150 words per minute, but our minds can actually think up words up to 500 words per minute or even more. So consequently, while I'm speaking and you're trying to listen, you have lots of time in your mind that's left unsupervised, and then your mind drifts to other things. So there are ways that you can try to help yourself to stay more focused. And I know that this is a recorded lecture, but whenever you're talking to someone, or even if you're in class, like leaning forward, your eye contact, we talked about reflective questions or even paraphrasing what you've heard, those kinds of things actually help. And then there's one other tool that the book doesn't mention that's a personal favorite of mine, especially whenever I'm listening to someone give a presentation and I'm going to be responsible for that information, but I'm having a hard time staying engaged. I actually play a game that's called the alphabet game. And then in my mind, I just listen for a word that starts with A, and then B, and then C, and then D, and I'm going through finding words that that person is saying that begins with those first letters of the alphabet. Now you would think that that would cause your mind to wander, but actually because you're listening for the words that that person is saying so that you can decide, does that start with an A, does that start with a B, etc. throughout the alphabet, that you're actually listening to what the person is saying. So if you're having difficulty following someone in a presentation, that is a tool that you might try sometime. Our sixth learning objective is to explain the importance of nonverbal communication and identify 6 major categories of nonverbal expression. So nonverbal communication is the interpersonal process of sending and receiving information both intentionally and unintentionally without using written language or spoken language. I actually find nonverbal communication to be extremely fascinating. We all use nonverbal communication and we all see other people's nonverbal communication. It can enhance a message, it can weaken a message, and it can actually replace a message. So nonverbal signals are things like your facial expression, your vocal characteristics, whether or not you're touching a person while you're talking to them. And in today's world, especially in the business world, I know the book talks about that, but I would really be careful about touching individuals in a work environment. Make sure that you're following your company's policy on that. But gestures and posture, even as I'm talking to you now and I'm recording this in my office and it's just me and the microphone and I'm pretending like I can see your face as I'm doing this, I'm actually sitting up in the chair, I'm leaning forward toward the mic, and I'm using my hand as hand gestures to try to help me to communicate even though you can't even see me. And whenever you can see me, of course, that adds to our communication. Personal appearance, and then also time and space. So just a couple real quick things to hit some highlights on this. A facial expression. Have you ever had somebody say, "Oh yeah, this is delicious," but the look on their face tells you that it's not, that they're not enjoying eating that? Your facial expressions are dead giveaways, and sometimes we don't even realize that our face is making that expression when our mouth is saying one thing but our face is saying something totally different, and chances are the person's going to go with what your face is saying rather than what your voice is saying. Now, in vocal characteristics, the book uses the sentence, "What are you doing?" And if I say, "What are you doing?" is different than if I say, "What are you doing?" or even, "What are you doing?" Each one of those can be interpreted in a different way just by the way that I've inflected on which word that I put the emphasis. And the book talks about personal appearance and how that is important because people do have a tendency to judge us by what we wear. Now, I used to teach this course at the master's level, and I remember in class one time that I had a student argue with me that personal appearance shouldn't really affect our nonverbal cues, and that people in today's age don't really care how we dress or what we wear. And I would have to disagree with him. And what I said to him was, okay, so if I walked into class today, and this was a face-to-face class rather than an online class, and I was wearing Daisy Duke jeans and a shirt that ties up around my waist, and I had on knee-high boots and a cowboy hat, what would your thought been of who I was as a professor? And he's like, okay, point well taken. So in as much as what you have on might be comfortable for you and might be the norm in the world that you live in, it doesn't necessarily mean it's the norm in the person's world that you're interacting with, especially in the business environment. So one point in particular that I would make with this is that when we moved here from Hawaii, my husband is an administrator at the hospital, and for his entire work history in the hospital, every day to work he wore a suit and tie and would always look very sharp with even a pocket silk that matched the tie, and he was just dressed very professional, very much like, probably would say what you might think like a lawyer would look like, which he's not a lawyer, but very professional in his business attire. Well, when he came here for an interview, he showed up in a suit like that, and somebody actually pulled him aside, told him to go to Macy's and buy a Hawaiian shirt and to not ever wear a suit and tie and to work again. And so we went out and bought clothes for him to have in his work here, and he dresses the way that is the norm for his organization, the hospital, and he wears a Hawaiian shirt tucked in with dress slacks, and that's what he wears to work because that's what is expected. And before we move on, I do also want to talk about time and space, because this is like what is comfortable for you when you're talking to somebody, how close that you are. Have you ever had people when they're talking to you, they're like standing too close and you either feel like you need to move back or you do actually physically move back because they're like in what you perceive as your personal space? Or perhaps you're talking to someone and they're standing so far away from you that you don't really feel like it's a personal conversation and you actually take a step toward them to help limit that. So that's what they're talking about with your nonverbal communication of time and space. Some people like to have people really up close or further back, but that can also impact your conversation and what you're saying, because if I'm standing a long distance away from you, you may automatically think that the message that I have for you is unpleasant, therefore I don't want to get too close to you. It can actually impact how people are hearing what you're saying. We're moving on to our learning objective number 7, explain the importance of business etiquette and identify 4 key areas in which good etiquette is essential. And because I'm trying to keep these lectures down to a reasonable amount of time, I want to go ahead and try to just kind of fly through some of these. We've already talked about your personal appearance. Make sure that you're dressing the way that is expected in the office that you're working in. Always make sure that you are clean, that you've brushed your teeth, combed your hair, all of those personal hygiene things before you come to work. And then also remember that even if you're on the phone, just like right now you can't see me, but you can hear my voice, and I tell you that I'm using my hand gestures, it helps my voice to come across with more inflection and helps me to do a better job of communicating. So remember that whenever you're on the phone, even though you can't be seen, people can still hear the inflections in your voice, and that makes a difference in how they perceive what you're saying. Our business etiquette in a social setting. Remember that if you are asked to represent your company, that you introduce yourself as you go around to meet people from other companies, whatever is the purpose of your being there, and that you always tell people what it is that you do at your company. And then whenever you introduce other people, it's good to be able to say something about that person. So if you know an interesting detail or something about them professionally, go ahead and mention that. And remember that you always introduce the less senior person to the more senior person. And that is just a point of etiquette. So if Susie is an assistant and you're introducing her to the vice president, you would introduce Susie to the vice president rather than the vice president to Susie. To me, that almost seems counterintuitive, but that is the way of business etiquette. If you are going to business meals, make sure that you're using appropriate etiquette at the table, that you're watching your conversation topics, and you're staying away from hot potatoes like politics and religion. And then if there is drinking available at the event, it is always best to not drink, or if you do drink, to wait until the very end of the meal to partake of any adult beverages. In a business setting, I have seen many people not follow that rule, and people who have been with organizations for years and years have too much to drink and make a faux pas that has cost them their job. So, you can have a drink at the end or after the event is over, but be very, very, very careful about drinking at business events. The PowerPoint also goes through etiquette about being online and things to do and not to do. I'm going to let you read through those at your leisure or as you read over this chapter, as well as the points about using a mobile device. A lot of these we've already talked about. So I'm going to conclude our lecture at this point, and I will see you for Chapter 3.